This week, we have a lot of stories about standing up for what is right directly in the face of what is wrong. This week, we have stories talking to us about how to be God's people in the world when it doesn't seem easy. We are called to not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. In other words, we are being called to think as God would think. Who is the Pharaoh in our world today? By Pharaoh being unnamed, we are reminded, as the Hebrew people have been reminded for 4,000 years, that there is always a Pharaoh. There is always the imperial power at work, trying to contain its own power and increase its own power. And we are being called to something different, to something better. So the Pharaoh calls out in patriotism, we need to get rid of those people. We need to kill off those people. We need to stop them from being a danger to us. And those voices that talk about those people, those outsiders, our Bible does something about that voice. It reminds us again and again in the Hebrew and Jewish understanding of who they are is always the recitation, the reminder. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. Remember, you were once the outsider. So all the language that says that there are insiders and there are outsiders, there are the people who are the problem, and then there's the rest of us good people, remember that can get turned against you. That can get turned against anyone. We are all God's beloved. We are all one, and we do not play the insider-outsider game like the rest of the world wants us to. There's a very strong pattern to do that. It's ingrained in our instincts, which is why we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, because our instincts teach us to keep with the safe people, to keep with the inside group, to have an inside group, and to keep the outsiders out. But God's dream is bigger and better than that, and so we all need to transform ourselves. Or not transform ourselves, but let God transform us. Have our minds renewed so that we don't get caught in that pattern of this world, but rather we can figure out what God's will is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So there's a standard for you: good, acceptable, and perfect. Is to realize that just because somebody powerful says something doesn't make it true. And we are called to something more, something bigger. And we are all called to it. If there's one thing that stands out for me this time around on this story about the women who saved Moses, is how diverse they are. I can't possibly do anything about the terrible Pharaoh. I'm just a little girl. No, wait a minute, you're Miriam. And I loved how that story added that detail about it being Miriam's idea to build an ark like Noah. I thought that was really cute. But the idea about Miriam being the one who walks along the riverbank and who brokers the deal with Pharaoh's daughter, even if you're a little powerless girl, part of a a persecuted minority group, there's still something you can do. If you are, I'm just an everyday worker. I work for the government, I do what I'm told, but I'm not doing that. There's no way I'm killing off the babies. It's my job to make sure the babies make it into the world safe, and I'm going to make sure they make it into the world safe, even if that means I have to lie to the Pharaoh. So there's just a little tidbit to chew on if you need something to chew on during the week of when is it okay to lie to protect somebody. Or you might think, what can I do? I'm Pharaoh's daughter. I live in the palace. I'm gilded and protected. I can't change what he does. I am too far away from it. I don't even know any Hebrews. How am I supposed to help the Hebrews? Well, she was darn sneaky. She managed to not only save one of the Hebrew babies, but managed to, and I think that she was clever enough to know that that wasn't just any little girl that was following the baby along, but was a relative. And she arranged to pay the baby's mother to raise the baby that she would then take back to the palace and raise as a prince. Clever. She used her position too. We all can. Use whatever we have, wherever we are in life, whatever opportunities we have, we can make a difference. We can fight the systemic brokenness that's around us if we have allowed ourselves to be transformed. And then dare I speak to the current circumstances. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. I read this in our current circumstances, and what I find myself thinking is don't think of yourself as more immune than you ought to. Don't think of yourself as less vulnerable than you ought to. Look at yourself with sober judgment, all of us. We get the news. 42 new cases reported yesterday, which means that sometime 2 to 3 weeks ago, 42 people got sick, got infected. We don't know what's happening right now, and we won't know for another few weeks. So we all have to look at ourselves with sober judgment to say, well, you know, it could be me. I'm not special. We're not special just because we're the church, despite the fact that churches aren't limited to the 10 people in gatherings. We're limited to 30% of our occupancy, providing people can maintain social distancing. That's not changing. The only thing that'll change for us is that we have to wear masks as a church. But in all the rest of your life, that be humble enough to realize that you might be somebody who has gotten infected, because people don't get infected because they're bad people. People don't get infected because the disease has judged them. The disease has only one goal in mind, and that's to make as many people sick as possible. It has no moral judgment. We have moral judgment, and so we have to try and outsmart the disease. So we put our best minds on it, and our best minds say 2 meters. 2 meters is there's a substantial difference in safety if you can keep the 2 meters. There's an increase in safety if you wear a mask. And they're all increments. This makes a difference. This makes a difference. Nothing is perfect. Nothing is 100%. We're all vulnerable. We have to face that, realize that we're vulnerable, and do the most loving things that we can, which is to do our best to protect the people around us. We don't know how it's all going to go, but we can do our best to be loving. that is what we're called to do and be. We are called to follow Jesus, who is not always going to see the world the way the rest of the world sees it. We are called to be loving. We are called to be subversive, to stand up against the brokenness in the world in every way we can and make the world better in whatever you can do in your corner. Let's do what we can. Let's make life as good as we can for the people around us. Thanks be to God. Amen.